So in this video, our goal is going to be to enter raw data and then create a basic graph of that raw data. So we're going to go over how to label up that graph with an appropriate title and appropriate X and Y axis labels. So I have a blank spreadsheet open here in Excel. I'm going to come on up, and first thing I need to enter my raw data. Let's pretend like for my experiment, mass is going to be the independent variable measured in grams. Always really helpful to include some sort of column header like this, just to remind yourself that's the data that you're going to be entering below it. And I'm going to make up some numbers just for the sake of this example. You would of course be entering in your real data. And let's say for my dependent variable, I'll be using the length in centimeters, for example. Now, presumably for a real experiment, you have done multiple trials, at least 3 trials. You've already found the average. So I'm going to pretend like right here I'm entering in my average length, that I've already completed those averages outside. And just for the sake of making up some data, something like that. Okay, so now we want to create a graph. So I'm going to highlight the X and Y coordinates that I would like to be graphed. I'm going to come up here to the Insert tab. And then over here to this tiny little button, when you hover over it, it'll say XY scatter. When you click that button, you'll see several options for scatter and bubbles. We're going to select the first option. This is going to quite literally plot our X and Y coordinates as points. When you click that, you can see that it's pulling from this data. It's highlighted for you, and you can start to see your graph right here. Now I'm going to make this bigger just so that we can see it and work with it a little bit. One thing that I'm noticing in this graph is that it kind of auto-assigned a title up here, but that's not the title that I want for my graph. So I'm just going to click on that title and highlight it all, and I'm going to replace it with a more appropriate title. Usually we title things the independent variable versus the dependent variable. Okay. I'm also noticing that I have no x-axis label and I have no y-axis label. So in order to add those labels, I'm going to come on over here to Add Chart Element, this button in the upper left corner. Notice that I'm seeing that in the Chart Design tab. That should be the default tab that comes up when you click anywhere on your graph. But in case it isn't coming up, just click back on your graph and it should come up again. So Add Chart Element, and we want to add an axis title. Let's start with the horizontal or the x-axis. And when I clicked that, this little axis title came up. We know that, of course, we should label it up with our variable and the units. If you would like, you could also highlight this and go into the Home tab. You could make this label bigger since it's a pretty small font if you would like. I'm going to come back to Chart Design, and I'm going to add another chart element. This time I'll go to Axis Titles, and I'm going to add the primary vertical or the Y-axis. Again, having to rename it. Good name would be your dependent variable with your units in parentheses. And you could highlight all of that and make it bigger in the Home tab if you would like. Okay. So here we have our data points plotted. We have our title, we have our x-axis label, our y-axis label. One thing that I'm noticing about this graph right now is that 0 is not, the origin is not in the lower left-hand corner for both axes. For the x-axis, it's nice and scaled up, and we do indeed start at 0. But for the y-axis, we're starting at 145. So that's really something that I want to change, because the origin, 0, 0, is going to be how I can orient myself and really start to better understand the data. So I'm going to click right on these numbers on my y-axis, and when I do so, you'll see this Format Axis show up to the right of your screen. And here you can see the bounds, the minimum is set to 145. Excel has just automatically scaled that for me, knowing that my data started at 150. But as a physicist, to orient ourselves, we really want to be starting at 0, 0. So I'm going to change that minimum. And it takes a minute to update. You probably have to click off of it. And now we can see that, yes, we are indeed starting down here at 0, and we can get a better picture of what our data looks like. So at this point, we have entered our raw data. We've created a graph of those data points. We've labeled up the title, the x-axis, the y-axis, and we have adjusted our axes in order to see 0, 0 in the bottom left corner.